Just a quick reminder that you can subscribe to the Morin Academy's free newsletter, and I will put that link in the show notes below. But today I wanted to get back into Plato's Gorgias. The rhetorician in a democracy is a type of ruler who uses the people like debris or clay or something like that. They kick them around, they do what they want with them, but they still have to pay attention to them. Ultimately, I think Callicles would want a situation where you didn't have to pay them any mind at all. But in the case where you're in a democracy, a rhetorician is the best possible situation, the best possible ruler. Now, Socrates says to this, "You see, my good Callicles, that you do not find the same fault with me as I with you, for you claim that I keep saying the same things and reproach me with it, but I make the opposite statement of you, that you never say the same thing about the same subjects. Previously, you defined the better and the more powerful as the stronger, and next as the wiser, and now you come forward with something else. The better and the more powerful are now described by you as more courageous. But my good sir, tell me, and have done with it, whom you mean by the better and the more powerful, and what is their sphere of action?" And then Callicles says, "But I told you, those who are wise in the affairs of state and courageous." Now, here we get to kind of the heart of the disagreement, is that in a way, they're both saying that it's best that the wise rule, the ones who know what they're doing, but they disagree profoundly on what the wise would conclude is good for themselves and others. Okay. And so for Socrates, the type of ruler that Callicles admires doesn't know what he's doing. So patiently, Socrates is going to try to teach Callicles again why it is that it takes a certain kind of wisdom, the best wisdom, to be able to avoid making yourself miserable. Okay. And so he asks if the better men that Callicles is talking about can be their own masters. Do they have themselves under control? Okay. So he does this by saying, "Tell me, my friend, what is their relationship to themselves? Are they rulers or subjects?" Callicles says, "What do you mean?" Which I think says it all, right? He doesn't even know what he means. And Socrates says, "I mean that every man is his own master, or is there no need for him to govern himself, but only to govern others?" And Callicles says again, what do you mean by governing himself? See, that had never occurred to him really. Like in his own life, what he wants, what he feels at the moment is what governs him. And I don't think he quite comprehends that there's an alternative, or he looks at those who try to pursue the alternative as unnatural and inhuman. They're not really like full men. Socrates says, "I don't mean anything very subtle, but merely the popular notion of being temperate and in control of yourself and mastering one's own pleasures and actions." So he introduces this theme of moderation, and he basically says, hey, is a leader really like powerful, and can he really be happy if he doesn't have his own self under control? Because if he doesn't have his own self under control, then, I mean, the implication is, and he's going to explain this, he's going to make serious mistakes that make him miserable. Now, Callicles responds by saying that this type of self-control or moderation is like slavery. He equates it to slavery. He says near 492, "Why, how could a man be happy when he's a slave to anybody at all?" Including himself, implication. "No, but the naturally noble and just is what I now describe to you with all frankness, namely, that anyone who is to live aright should suffer his appetites to grow to the greatest extent and not check them, and through courage and intelligence should become competent to minister to them at their greatest, and to satisfy every desire with what it craves. But this, I imagine, is impossible for the mob or many. Hence, they blame such men through a sense of shame to conceal their own impotence." Okay, so he's very clear here. Life is about having desires that come into your heart of their own accord and fulfilling those desires. And the many have those desires, but they don't have the excellence to be able to fulfill them, to achieve them. And so they think in terms of moderation and temperance and talk and preach about that because they're basically jealous and envious of those who can get what they want. But everybody would do this if they could. So he not only doesn't think that self-control in the terms of desires is possible, but to the extent that people try it, they're doing something, again, unnatural. A little bit further on, he says, for to those whose lot it has been from the beginning to be the sons of kings, or whose natural gifts enable them to acquire some office or tyranny or supreme power, what in truth could be worse and more shameful than temperance and justice? For though at liberty without any hindrance to enjoy their blessings, they would themselves invite the laws, the talk, and the censure of the many to be masters over them. So in his view, the most shameful thing is for people like Socrates, who have the brain power to be able to get what they want in their desires in their heart, to control themselves, because that's the most unnatural of all. And Socrates then follows it up, trying to teach him that unless he and others like him can get that self-control or moderation, they are going to be forever suffering. He says that life is like a living hell. He compares it to an accursed person who is condemned to carry water in a perforated sleeve, or, some jar that is leaking, and never makes it all the way back home. And he has to continue to go back to the well repeatedly, never accomplishing the purpose. Or like a plover, which is a bird that lives on the beach and eats many times its weight, according to Socrates anyway, each day. So it is constantly burying its head in the sand. And he's basically saying, would you want to be either one of those two types? Okay, would you want to be somebody who is always desiring that water, always thirsty and toiling to get it, but you can't, and you just have to keep, is that really pleasurable, or is that actually quite painful? So here he's introducing again this idea that no, slavery is not having yourself under control and basically obeying your rational part. Rather, slavery, true slavery of the soul, is when the desires rule and are not ruled by reason. Because remember, the Socratic idea of justice is the well-ordered soul, where reason rules over your spiritedness and your bodily desires, and has those under control so that they can be used appropriately to make one happy and to achieve good ends. Okay, so this is all to give Callicles the lesson that he needs to get himself under control, that this is not some form of slavery, but his only hope for freedom. Now, this whole line of argument reminds me very much of Thomas Hobbes's argument in Leviathan 11, where he describes human nature very much as Callicles conceives it. There's a great correspondence between Callicles and the other guys, Polus and Gorgias, their views of human nature, and Hobbes's. And so we see again how, an ancient philosopher like Plato could anticipate modern political thought. Of course, Hobbes takes this basic insight on human nature, combines it with a very modern scientific outlook, and begins to frame an entire, liberal social contract theory, proto-liberal. But anyway, the quote that I had in mind from Hobbes' Leviathan is here. He says, this is Hobbes, he says, in the first place, I put for a general inclination of all mankind a perpetual and restless desire of power after power that ceases only in death. And the cause of this is not always that a man hopes for a more intensive delight than he already has attained, or that he cannot be content with a moderate power, but because he cannot assure the power and the means to live well which he has at present without the acquisition of more. So he introduces, and so does Callicles and Polus and Gorgias. They all introduce this like dynamic of competition into the mix too. If there was ever any time that a person might feel like they want to just rest and enjoy what they have obtained, whether it be safety, material goods, whatever, they can't do that because there are all these other people, including, I'm sure, in the minds of the rhetorician, the mob, who would want to get the upper hand against them. So that, this was discussed by Socrates earlier, that the ruler fears everybody around him. If he's unjust, if he's taking from others, he's got to constantly be looking for ways to increase his power. So Hobbes combines both of those insights of these ancient realists and moves them forward into modern liberal social contract theory. So just stating the obvious, ancient Greek political thought is kind of the antithesis of this modern notion, right? Like you see the antithesis even in ancient thought. They understood the Hobbes type of philosophy. And so we can go back to the thought of Plato and Aristotle if we want to find the best counter argument to the modern liberal way of thinking. Ultimately, Socrates wants to hammer into Callicles' head that pleasure, what feels good at the moment, and the good, what is actually good for us and others, are just not the same thing. Sometimes they happen to coincide, but they are to be distinguished. And of course, Socrates and Plato and Aristotle are huge on making distinctions, something that sometimes gets lost in our modern way of thinking. But if you can't make distinctions appropriately, you literally can't think well. So what does he mean by this? Well, I have this picture of this guy. He's probably somebody famous and I don't know it. But anyway, this picture reminded me of, the situation of somebody who's adrift on a raft out in the middle of the ocean, and they're getting very thirsty, they're stranded, and they have to decide, there's no rain in the forecast, do they drink the ocean water? Well, we all know if you drink the ocean water, because of the salt in it, as well as the microbes, I'm sure, like you're going to die sooner than if you just didn't, but it's going to feel really good. Okay. But in the best interest of your survival, in the hopes that you will be rescued alive, you should forego it, but it's going to feel so good, right? We can think of so many things that we do every day. Maybe for you, it's fitness or eating a healthier diet or just going to the dentist or the doctor. None of these things are pleasant in and of themselves, or at least, well, I would say fitness and eating right could be after a while, after you get used to them, but not at first, okay? And we all know that oftentimes what feels really good in the moment is extremely harmful to us. So this is all that Socrates is really pointing out here, but it's very telling that he has to like repeatedly say it, and that Callicles is so impervious to this argument. Socrates then asks Callicles about, these famous Athenian politicians, all of whom in their own way moved Athenian democracy and empire forward. And they're all like revered and admired in Athenian society. But he asks, did any of them really know what was actually good for themselves and others? And he makes the point that all of them at times failed and brought about disastrous things. And I'll just pinpoint Pericles, who was actually, I think more than once, fined by the Athenian people, and in one case knocked out of office for the perceived mistakes that he made. He was not always able, even him with his great rhetorical power, he wasn't always able to ride the crest of the wave that was Athenian democracy. When the Spartans attacked Athens, and he had created this sort of barrier where he had told the Athenian people to get behind their walls, abandon their country property, all their farmland and stuff. And the Spartans attacked the coastal areas and razed everything to the ground outside the walls. They got angry about that. They were like, wait, what about our property? And then furthermore, a plague developed in the city because they were so crowded together, and they blamed him for that. Anyway, it is far from clear that any of these leaders always benefited themselves or their people. Each of them made mistakes. Great leaders always do. And I think underlying this critique is this more fundamental critique that Socrates has of this type of leadership, period, and empire, right? Like, he fundamentally disagrees that the Athenian empire that they worked so hard to expand was good. In fact, in his view, and we get this through a variety of dialogues, but in his view, the things that it brought, wealth, slavery, okay, dominating attitudes, injustice, these things were bad for the Athenians. Okay, so that was his attitude, and it comes out here. And of course, there's this great incredulity as Callicles, and no doubt the other people listening to this are just like astounded that anybody would say these guys weren't 100% admirable, that they weren't to be envied, that anybody would want to be them. And so this is further proof in their mind that Socrates is just kind of crazy. And then, doubling down on his craziness, Socrates introduces a different kind of leader, the idea of a different kind of leader. Now, at this point, Callicles is just answering in a robotic fashion because he has checked out. Okay, it's not that he agrees. If you read this and you see him agreeing, you might say, oh my gosh, Socrates finally won. He's not winning if that means he's getting Callicles to agree. But Socrates is talking to Callicles about what kind of words actually are useful for both the speaker and those who are being spoken to. And it turns out that they're words about justice. Okay, and so he calls the leader who uses words to teach people about order and justice the true orator, or the true moral artist. And he says, and is it not with his eye on these things that our orator, the true and good artist, will bring to bear upon our souls the words he utters and all his actions too, and give any gift he gives, or take away what he takes, his mind always occupied with one thought, how justice may be implanted in the souls of the citizens and injustice banished, how temperance may be implanted and indiscipline banished, and how goodness in general may be engendered and wickedness depart. Do you agree or not? And of course, Callicles says, I agree. So we see Socrates introducing the idea of an orator who is philosophically informed. Now, there's room for interpretation here as to who this orator really is. Is this orator a rhetorician in a democracy informed by philosophy who actually uses rhetoric, including maybe deceptive rhetoric, or at least not complete rational reasoning, to convey justice to people? Is it a good politician? Or is it somebody like Socrates who stays apart from actual politics but criticizes it from the outside because he's an actual philosopher? It's not clear, in other words, whether Socrates is talking about himself or he's talking about what he would have liked maybe Alcibiades to be, his beloved student. Would he have wanted Alcibiades or somebody like him to be able to use his incredible eloquence in order to make democracy actually work? It's questionable, okay? But what we do know is that a true moral artist uses speech to instill order, and order is justice, basically. Okay, if you have justice, you have good order in society. And what causes order is the philosophic knowledge of justice. Socrates then, to try to goad Callicles into some sort of response, suggests that it's actually better for a man to die than to do injustice, because injustice would harm his soul, which is the highest part of who he is. And Callicles just sort of expresses frustration and incredulity, but he refuses to engage. And Socrates then gives Callicles this alternative version of manly courage. Now, you may recall that Callicles earlier in their exchange had called Socrates unmanly and childish and womanly, okay, implying that Socrates was a coward because he didn't want to get into the game and get some action and stop, driveling with young boys over in the corner over here, right? So all of that, remember all of that, okay? And you remember that Socrates didn't answer at the time with, okay, Callicles, you're more unmanly than I am, or something like that, like, no, the true like child here is you, Callicles. But here he actually does answer. This is near 511. This is the answer to Callicles on the charge of unmanliness. Socrates says, do you, addressing Callicles, do you imagine that one should bend all of his efforts to living as long as possible and practicing those arts that constantly save us from dangers, such as the rhetoric that you bid me to practice, which preserves one's life in the law courts? So he's saying, look who's taking risks here. Callicles, you are doing everything you can to be on top of the power heap. You're afraid that you might be hurt. At any point, you might enjoy what you have, but you can't, because you have to always defend yourself against the real or imagined oncomers who would take it away. You see the world as a hostile place. And the number one job of the person, in your view, is to protect himself. So you're enslaved by all of that, by that framework, to do only certain types of things. Whereas I am free, because the price of freedom is being vulnerable to potentially losing your life, to actually disregard life to a certain extent. Now, Socrates isn't saying, life is no good, or that, a total disregard of life under all circumstances is good, but rather that one shouldn't put mere life, at the very top of one's priority list, because that causes people to behave in a craven, slavish fashion. And instead, he says, a sensible person is someone who puts those concerns about sheer survival aside so that they can do what they want. Socrates can change his mind. He can decide to do one thing and then another, depending upon what his reason tells him to do. Callicles, in his view, cannot, and is truly the coward and the lesser man. And I have this famous painting of Socrates here, because if that doesn't say manly, I don't know what does. Here he is having his hemlock about to be executed, and he's revealing like this magnificent six-pack, like. So I'll leave you with that. Think about that. Of course, this stuff is couched in the verbiage of manliness, but one can abstract from that and ask, what is the truly human life?